Wyoming, 1885. Nathaniel Boone stood on the platform at Larkspur Station with a ticket stub in one hand and 9 months of letters in the other, and he had never in his life wanted to get back on a horse and ride away from something so badly. The train was visible now, a smudge of black smoke against the gray foothills, coming on slow the way trains came on in that country, like the land itself was reluctant to let anything move through it quickly. Nathaniel was 46 years old. He had a ranch 11 miles north of town, 900 acres of grass and timber his father had homesteaded, and he had spent 26 years keeping whole, and he had a letter in his coat pocket, the last one she'd sent, that he had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft as cloth. He did not know what she looked like. There had been no photograph. He had asked, careful about it, and she had written back that a face in a tintype was a stranger's face, no matter whose it was, and that if he wanted to know her, he should keep reading her letters, because that was the only honest likeness she had to send. He had decided he liked her for that answer. Her name was Margaret Ashford. She was 24 years old. She had answered an advertisement he had placed in the matrimonial pages of a Chicago paper the previous autumn. 4 lines he had rewritten a dozen times before he let it stand. Rancher, 45, Wyoming Territory, seeks correspondence with a woman of good character. Object matrimony. Land, cattle, a sound house. No fortune beyond what honest work has made. Will answer all letters. He had not expected Margaret Ashford, whose first letter had been 3 pages, careful and funny and entirely unsentimental about why she was writing to a stranger in Wyoming Territory. Her father had died owing more than the family had. Her mother had remarried a man who made it clear, without ever quite saying it, that there was room in the house for his own children and not much left over for hers. She was not desperate, she had written, only practical. A stranger's honest offer in a far territory was a better bet than staying somewhere she was tolerated rather than wanted. "I am not looking for romance, Mr. Boone," she had written in that first letter. "I am looking for a fair arrangement and a man who will keep his word. If you can offer that, I believe we might suit each other well enough." He had liked that, too. He had liked it for 9 months of letters, through a winter and a spring and most of a summer, 2 and sometimes 3 a month, growing longer, growing easier, until somewhere in May he had stopped reading them like a man reviewing an application and started reading them like a man waiting for word from someone he already loved a little, though neither of them had used that word, not once, not in 9 months and 40-some letters. And now the train was close enough that he could hear it, and Nathaniel Boone stood on the platform and thought, with the sudden, complete clarity of a man facing a thing he cannot take back, that he had let himself fall in love with paper, and paper had never once had to look him in the eye and decide whether 46 was too old, whether a rancher's hands and a rancher's weathered face were what she had pictured when she pictured a husband, whether the whole arrangement, now that it was a real platform and a real train, and not an ocean of distance and ink, was a mistake she was about to make in person instead of on paper, where it was easier to walk away from. He almost turned around. The thought arrived whole and complete. I could be gone before she steps down. She would think the train missed me, and she could go back east, and never know a man stood here and lost his nerve. He did not move. He had told himself, the whole 11 miles into town that morning, that whatever happened on this platform, he was not going to be the kind of man who didn't show up. He had given her his word in 40 letters. He held to it now, with his boots planted and his hat in his hands, and the train came in. She was the 3rd person off, behind a drummer with a sample case and an older woman with a hat box, and Nathaniel knew her before she'd fully cleared the steps. The way you know a thing you've been imagining for 9 months the instant it stops being imaginary. She was tall, taller than he'd pictured, with light brown hair under a traveling bonnet that had seen better days and a coat that had clearly been made over more than once, turned at the cuffs, the seams pressed flat the way you press a seam to hide that it's been opened and closed before. She had one trunk, not large, and she carried it herself. setting it down on the platform with the unshowy competence of a woman who had carried her own trunk a long way already and expected to go on doing it. Her eyes found him the way his had found her, immediately, with the same unmistakable certainty, two strangers who had somehow already met 40 times on paper and recognized each other anyway. She did not smile right away. She looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at a thing you've decided about in advance and are now checking against the reality, and Nathaniel had the distinct sense that she was doing her own version of what he had just done at the fence rail, deciding, in the space of a few seconds, whether to be brave. "Mr. Boone," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected, and underneath the steadiness was something else, something that hadn't quite settled yet. "Miss Ashford." He took his hat the rest of the way off, which he realized, foolishly, he had been holding without quite removing. "Margaret, if I may." "You may." She looked at him another moment. Then, before he could say anything else, before he could offer to carry her trunk or ask after her journey or do any of the dozen practical things he had rehearsed on the ride-in, she said the thing she had clearly decided, somewhere on the long, rattling miles of track behind her, that she needed to say first, before either of them pretended this was simpler than it was. "You paid my fare," she said, "all of it, the whole way from Springfield. You don't know me, not really, not the way you know a person you've stood across a kitchen table from, and you sent the money anyway, on the strength of some letters." She held his gaze, and he saw now what the unsettled thing under her steadiness was. It was courage, working. "So I want you to know, before either of us says another word that commits us to anything, you can send me back if you want. If I'm not what you pictured, I won't make a scene about it. I'd rather know now, plainly, than spend a year finding out slowly." The platform was busy around them, the drummer hauling his sample case toward the hotel, the conductor calling something to a porter, and none of it touched the small, quiet space the two of them were standing in. Nathaniel Boone looked at this woman, who had just gotten off a train after 4 days of travel, and immediately handed him an exit, not because she wanted to leave, but because she understood, with a clarity he found himself admiring before he'd even decided to, that a fair arrangement required both people to be able to walk away from it. She was not performing fragility for him to rescue. She was doing the opposite. She was making sure neither of them would be trapped by politeness into a marriage they didn't choose. "I could say the same to you," he said. "You don't know me either. Letters tell a man's handwriting and not much else. You're welcome to look me over a week or two before you decide anything's settled." He paused. "But I'll tell you plain, Margaret. I rode in here this morning, fully prepared to be too old and too plain and too set in my ways for a woman who wrote letters as fine as yours. I was bracing for you to be the one doing the sending back." That broke something in her face. Not quite a smile yet, but the steadiness cracked into something warmer underneath it. "You read every one of my letters that carefully?" "I read them until the folds gave out," he said, and held up the one in his coat pocket as proof, soft as cloth at every crease, and she looked at it, and then at him, and the thing that had been unsettled in her face since she stepped off the train settled all at once into something that looked a great deal like relief. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'd better not waste a fair arrangement standing on a platform." She looked down at her trunk. "Is it far to the ranch?" 11 miles, he said. "I'll get the trunk." She let him take it. It was the first thing she let him do for her, and Nathaniel noted, without saying anything about it, that she had waited to see whether he would offer before she gave it up, and that small fact told him more about Margaret Ashford than the 9 months of letters had. The wagon ride out took the better part of 2 hours, and they talked the whole way, easily, the way you talk to someone you've already written 40 letters to, only now the voice had a face attached to it. "It's bigger than I pictured," she said, looking out at the grass running gold to the foothills. "The land. You wrote about it, but I don't think I understood the scale until now." "Most people don't, until they're standing in it," Nathaniel said. "It looks empty from a train window. It isn't. It's just quiet about being full." She turned that over for a moment. "I like that," she said. "Quiet about being full. I might use that." You're welcome to it. I write some, she admitted. Not for publication, just things I notice. My mother always said it was a waste of good paper. There was something careful in the way she said it, the small flinch of a thing that had been criticized often enough to need bracing before it was offered. I'd like to read some of it sometime, Nathaniel said, if you'd let me. You haven't even seen the house yet. You might take it back once you have. I won't, he said, and there was nothing performed in the way he said it. The house, when they reached it, was sound and plain, log and plank, a good stone chimney, a porch his father had built before Nathaniel was born, and that Nathaniel had kept up faithfully since, the way he kept up everything that had been left to him. It was not large. It was not fine. It was, Margaret said, standing in the yard and looking at it with the same memorizing attention she'd given the grass, exactly what his letters had described, which she said as if that mattered to her more than whether it was grand. You didn't oversell it, she said. I appreciate that. My stepfather oversells everything. I've gotten very tired of men who oversell things. I'd rather you be surprised by what's good about it than disappointed by what wasn't there, Nathaniel said. She looked at him for a moment, the same assessing look from the platform, and something in her face settled a little further. They were married 3 days later, by the circuit preacher who came through Larkspur once a month, and happened, by good fortune, to be in town that week. It was a plain ceremony in the front room of the house, with Nathaniel's nearest neighbors, the Hollis family, standing as witnesses, and Margaret wearing a gray traveling dress because she had not packed anything finer and had not wanted to spend money on a dress for a wedding she had still, 3 days before, not been entirely certain would happen. You could have waited, Nathaniel said, the evening before, sitting across the kitchen table from her over coffee. Taken longer, to be sure. I am sure, Margaret said. I decided on the platform, more or less. I just needed you to know I hadn't decided out of desperation. There's a difference between choosing a thing and being unable to choose anything else. And which one is this? She considered the question with the same care she gave everything. I chose you because you read my letters until the folds wore out, she said. Because you told me the house wasn't grand, instead of letting me imagine something better and be disappointed. I've been chosen carelessly before, Nathaniel, by my stepfather, who chose to marry my mother and did not choose to want her children. I know what careless looks like. This isn't that. Nathaniel did not say anything for a moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the first time he had touched her with any kind of intention beyond practical help, and she let him. Before we go on, I want to pause and say thank you. From the United States to Canada, from the United Kingdom to Australia, from Ireland to New Zealand, wherever you're listening tonight, I'm grateful you're here. If Nathaniel and Margaret are keeping you good company this evening, a like means more than you know. And tell me, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. Now let's get back, because the real test of this marriage hasn't started yet, and it's going to come from a town that doesn't know what to make of a bride who arrived by train and a rancher who's old enough to be considered settled in his ways. Larkspur had opinions about the new Mrs. Boone, because Larkspur, like every small town in that country, had opinions about everything, and a mail-order bride was the kind of news that did not stay quiet for long. The opinions split 2 ways. There were those who thought it was a fine, sensible arrangement. Nathaniel Boone was a good man, steady and well-regarded, and a rancher his age with no wife and no children was a worry the whole valley had been quietly carrying for years, the kind of thing people mentioned at church without quite saying it outright. Mrs. Hollis, who had stood witness at the wedding, told anyone who'd listened that Margaret Ashford had a clear eye and a steady hand and would do the Boone place a world of good. And there were those, mostly the wives of younger, more prosperous men in town, who found the whole arrangement faintly scandalous, or at least worth a raised eyebrow, a girl of 24 marrying a man past 40, sight unseen until the very platform, for nothing more than a letter and a ticket. Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the dry goods in Larkspur and considered herself the moral compass of the town's domestic arrangements, made a point of being in the store the first time Margaret came in for supplies, and made an equal point of looking her over with the particular thoroughness of a woman conducting an inspection. "You're young to have come so far for a man you'd never met," Mrs. Pruitt said, in the tone of someone offering concern that was not entirely concern. 24, are you? And Mr. Boone must be, what, past 45? 46, Margaret said pleasantly, setting her purchases on the counter. And I'm 24. You've done the arithmetic correctly, Mrs. Pruitt. I only mean, Mrs. Pruitt said, undeterred, that it's a great deal of years to ask a young woman to give up. Most girls your age are thinking of dances, not of settling down with a man old enough to be my father, Margaret said, finishing the sentence Mrs. Pruitt had clearly been working toward, her tone unchanged, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd snapped. I've heard the comparison. I had a father who chose me. He died when I was 16, owing more than he had, but everything he did with me in mind. I have a stepfather who tolerates me, which is a different thing entirely, and considerably worse than not having one at all. Nathaniel Boone wrote to me for 9 months before he ever saw my face, and in every letter he asked about my opinions on things he could have simply told me his own about. He has never once, in 3 weeks of marriage, made me feel like an afterthought in my own house. She picked up her parcel. So no, I don't think the years are the thing worth counting, but I appreciate your concern. She left the store with her chin level and her step unhurried, and Mrs. Pruitt stood at her counter for a long moment, with the particular expression of a woman who has been thoroughly and politely defeated, and is still working out exactly how it happened. By the time the story reached Nathaniel, and stories in Larkspur always reached everyone eventually, he found Margaret out at the chicken coop, mending a section of wire fencing that had come loose, working with the same careful, unshowy competence she did everything with. I hear you, set Edna Pruitt straight at the dry goods, he said. I was polite about it, Margaret said, not looking up from the wire. I heard you were entirely polite. That's apparently what made it worse for her. He leaned against the post, watching her work. You didn't have to defend the arrangement to her. It's nobody's business but ours. I know, Margaret said. I wasn't defending it to her. I was saying it out loud for myself. There's a difference. I've spent a good deal of my life being talked about as though my choices needed someone else's approval to count. I'm done with that. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. I think you might be the steadiest person I've ever met. I think you might be the first person to notice. That autumn, the work of the ranch settled into a rhythm neither of them had quite expected, but both of them, separately, found they were glad of. Margaret had grown up in a house with money once and then a house without it, and she had learned in the years between the two how to keep accounts, how to make $1 do the work of $1.25. And within a month of arriving at the Boone place, she had gone through Nathaniel's ledgers with a quiet, thorough attention that found 2 debts he'd been carrying longer than he needed to, and a feed arrangement with the mill in town that was costing more than it should have. She did not announce these findings as a correction of his judgment. She simply laid them out at the kitchen table one evening, plainly, the way she did everything, and asked whether he wanted her opinion on what to do about them. I want your opinion on everything, Nathaniel said, and meant it, and Margaret, who had spent her whole life in houses where her opinions were tolerated rather than wanted, sat with that sentence for a long moment before she answered. She was good with the cattle, too, in a way that surprised him. She'd grown up in Springfield, in a townhouse, with no more exposure to livestock than any other city-raised girl. She learned fast, asked the right questions, and by the time the first snow came, she could move a small herd between pastures on her own without losing track of a single animal, which she did, the first time, with the quiet satisfaction of someone proving something to herself rather than to him. What Nathaniel noticed most, though, in those first months was smaller than any of that. It was the way Margaret had begun, without ever announcing it, to write things down. He found a notebook on the kitchen table one evening, left open, and though he did not read it, he had told her he wanted to be invited, not to intrude. He saw enough of her handwriting in passing to see that she was describing the ranch, the weather, the particular gold the grass turned in October, the way Hector the Hollis's dog had taken to following her on her morning rounds. She was doing, in her own private way, exactly what she'd told him she did, noticing things and setting them down. And Nathaniel found himself, more than once, watching her write with an expression he didn't examine too closely, because examining it too closely would have meant admitting how completely he had come to love a woman he'd known for less than half a year. He asked her, finally, on an evening in November, sitting by the fire while the wind worked at the windows, "Will you let me read some of it now?" Margaret looked up from the notebook in her lap. She considered the question the way she considered everything, weighing it, and then, without a word, she turned the notebook around and held it out to him. He read for a long while in silence. It was, as she'd said, not for publication, observations, fragments, small exact descriptions of the land and the work, and the particular quality of a Wyoming evening. Woven through it were observations of him, the way he stood at the fence in the mornings before the cattle were moved, looking at the mountains like he was taking attendance of something. A line, near the most recent page, that read simply, "I came west prepared to be tolerated. I did not expect to be seen." Nathaniel closed the notebook and sat with it in his lap for a long moment. "You weren't desperate when you wrote to me," he said quietly, "but I think you were lonely in a way that had gone on so long you'd stopped naming it." "Yes," Margaret said. "I was the same," he said. 26 years on this place, since my father died, and I'd gotten so used to the quiet, I'd convinced myself it was peace. It wasn't peace. It was just absence with good manners." Margaret took the notebook back gently, set it aside, and took his hand instead. "Well," she said, "it isn't absence anymore." Their first winter together was hard, the way Wyoming winters were hard, 3 weeks of cold deep enough to crack the water lines, but it was, both of them agreed later, the best winter either of them could remember, because for the first time in a long while, neither of them was facing it alone. Margaret kept the books and wrote in her notebook and learned to bake bread that didn't come out heavy, which took her most of December to manage, and which she announced with the particular triumph of a person who has earned a small, hard-won competence. Nathaniel taught her to read the sky for weather, the way his father had taught him, and found that she learned it faster than he had at her age, because she paid attention the way she paid attention to everything, completely, without distraction. In the spring, Mrs. Pruitt came out to the ranch herself, on the pretext of delivering an order Margaret hadn't placed, and stayed for tea, and left 2 hours later having apparently revised her opinion of the arrangement entirely, because she told half of Larkspur by the following Sunday that the Boone place had never looked better kept, that the young Mrs. Boone had a remarkably sound head for accounts, and that perhaps there was something to be said for an arrangement built on letters and plain speaking rather than dances and courtship, since the Boones seemed, by her own careful observation, to be considerably happier than most couples half their combined age difference apart. Their daughter was born the following winter, in January, during a storm that kept the midwife from the Hollis place stranded an extra day on the road, and had Nathaniel pacing the porch in a way Margaret found, even through her own labor, quietly endearing when she heard about it afterward. They named her Eleanor, for Margaret's mother's mother, a woman Margaret had loved and had not been able to save from the slow, grinding poverty that had eventually cost the family everything, and Nathaniel held his daughter for the first time with the particular careful seriousness he brought to everything that mattered, and looked at Margaret, exhausted and triumphant in the bed beside him, and said the only thing he could think to say. "You could have sent yourself back," he said. "That first day, on the platform, you could have decided I wasn't what you pictured and asked for a ticket east." "I know," Margaret said. "Why didn't you?" She looked at their daughter, and then at him, with the same steady, assessing look she'd given him on the platform 2 years before, the look of a woman who decided things carefully and did not unmake her decisions lightly. "Because you offered me the door first," she said. "Before I even had to ask for it, A man who hands you the door before you've asked isn't a man who'll ever try to lock it. She reached over and took his hand. I knew, standing on that platform, that I'd rather take my chances with a man who'd let me leave than spend my life with one who never gave me the choice. On a Thursday evening that autumn, 18 months after the platform at Larkspur Station, Nathaniel found Margaret on the porch, with Eleanor asleep against her shoulder, looking out at the grass running gold toward the foothills the way it had the day he'd first driven her out from town. "Quiet about being full," he said, sitting down beside her, repeating the words she'd used that first day. "You remembered that." "I remember everything you've ever said to me," Nathaniel said. "I had 9 months of letters to practice on before I ever heard your voice. I had a head start most husbands don't get." Margaret smiled, the small, private smile she had, and leaned into him, careful not to wake their daughter. "I used to think the letters were the safe part," she said, "and the platform was the dangerous part. The unknown thing. I had it backward. The letters were the leap. By the time the train came in, I think I already knew." "Knew what?" "That I wasn't going to ask you to send me back," she said. "Not because I had nowhere else to go. Because I'd already found the place I wanted to be." Nathaniel Boone almost rode away from the best thing that ever happened to him, on a platform at Larkspur Station, on the strength of 9 months of letters and a fear that paper love couldn't survive being looked at in person. He didn't ride away, but the temptation was real, and it's worth saying plainly, because it's the temptation a lot of us carry without ever standing on a literal platform to face it. The fear that the real version of a good thing will disappoint us the way the imagined version never could. Margaret Ashford did something braver than staying. She got off a train after 4 days of travel, in a coat that had been turned at the cuffs more than once, and the very first thing she did, before either of them had said a single word that bound them to anything, was hand her new husband the freedom to change his mind. Not because she expected him to use it, because a choice that can't be unmade isn't really a choice at all, and she had spent her whole life being chosen carelessly, and she was not going to start her marriage that way, not even once. That's the part of this story I keep coming back to. Not the wedding, not the ranch, not even the letters, as fine as they were. It's the moment on the platform when two frightened, hopeful people each quietly offered the other an exit, and neither one of them took it. Real love, the kind that lasts, isn't the love that traps you into staying. It's the love that hands you the door and trusts you to close it yourself, from the inside, because you wanted to all along. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart. You gave me something I never take lightly, your time and your attention. These stories only exist because of you. Every comment, every like, every person who shares an episode with someone who might need a quiet hour, that's what keeps this going. Wherever you are tonight, in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Ireland, in New Zealand, I hope Nathaniel and Margaret gave you something warm to carry. May God bless every single one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep riding.